Hello and welcome to episode 11 of What Makes This Song Special. For those of you who haven't tuned in before, what I do every week is I pick a different song. I talk a wee bit about what that song means to me, why is it special to me, what does it remind me of when I close my eyes and listen to it, what part of my life does it take me to. I tell a wee story about that. I then talk a wee bit about the band and the artist and do a bit of a vocal coach reaction in terms of technique to the singer. And then I do a part 2 follow-up video where I do my own version of the song. So this week's song is going to be David Gray, Babylon. Great track, and I'll talk a wee bit about the song itself later on. But first of all, the story as always. So it was 1999, and I just left school. I was taking a year out of school or of education. That turned into a few years before going to university. Felt like everyone I knew was off to uni at that point, and I was kind of quite isolated. I felt quite in limbo as to what I was going to be doing with my life. I had this dream about being a rock star, and everybody was away to do higher education, and I decided to get a part-time job in a restaurant, washing dishes, washing pots. In a place called Parklands Country Club in Newton Mearns, which was quite near where I stayed at the time. Mum and Dad's house was just round the corner from there, so there was this kind of fancy country club. I remember like famous footballers and things were members there, and it all seemed like quite a cool place to work. You got to see some famous people every so often, and met some really cool people there, which I'll go into in a second. I needed that part-time job. Basically, I don't know if it works this way in other cities as well or in other countries, but in Glasgow, unless you're playing cover versions in a function band or a wedding band, you're basically at the mercy of pub and club owners who think they're sort of doing you a favour by letting you bring 100 plus people along to their venue every week to spend money and drink and entry fees, and then think they get away with not paying you anything, and because they're giving you exposure for your own music if you're playing your own songs and things like that. Unfortunately, exposure doesn't really pay the bills, so whilst I was out playing what we called at the time the toilet tour, because of all the dreadful dives that we played in, I had to wash some pots and dishes to make some pocket money, to have money to spend to go out and do things that were the things you do when you're sort of 17, 18. So as always, when you start a new job, you meet sort of new people and new experiences, and I met some really interesting characters at Parklands, and there are plenty of stories for future episodes that revolve around some of the decorated characters and experiences of that particular job. But one of the first people I met when I first started that job, and the first week that I started, was a guy called Davy Russell, who I kind of lost touch with. I haven't spoken to Davy Russell in many, many years. I don't know where he is these days, but he was at uni studying something. I remember it sounded complicated. It was definitely an intelligent character. He was off at uni studying something awesome, and but he was working part time as a chef de commis. A chef de commis is a kind of French term for a beginner, a trainee helper chef. The chef that sort of helps the sort of further up the chain chefs pull everything together. And we used to talk about music when we were on shift together. He hated the bands that I was into, and instead sort of preferred more modern artists, which I in turn also hated. So we used to we had an amusing relationship where when we were on shift together, we would just wind each other up about anything for the sake of it. We would sort of talk about, if he said he liked something, I would immediately say that I didn't like it, and it was in a funny way. We used to kind of wind each other up and laugh. I think we both knew we were doing it on purpose, but we did have different outlooks on things and outlooks in life. So I remember one time he brought me in a book about Genghis Khan. It was like the history of Genghis Khan, and he wanted me to read it to prove how much more powerful a leader Genghis Khan was than Julius Caesar, knowing that I've got a Julius Caesar tattoo in my arm, and because I'm half Roman, and he wanted to sort of wind me up about that. It's like Julius Caesar's rubbish compared to Genghis Khan, and I would do similar things to him to wind him up. But one evening we decided to swap a CD. So I said, look, you hate my music, I hate your music. Why don't I bring you in a great album that you've not heard, and you do the same, and we will, try and like, or at least give a chance to each other's music. So I brought him in A Day at the Races by Queen, which is a phenomenal album in my opinion. He laughed as soon as I gave him it, and he said it was the kind of album that his mum had in her collection. And he handed me White Ladder by David Gray. So I remember having the White Ladder album lying on my bedside cabinet in my bedroom, and I didn't listen to it. It was a couple of weeks went by, and he kept, every time we were on shift together, he would say, "Have you listened to that album yet? It's so good." And I would say, "Oh yeah, I haven't got around to it. And then one day I was doing some weights. I had like a wee weights bench in my room and a chin up bar and stuff. And I thought, right, I'm going to do a workout. I might as well kill two birds with one stone. I'll listen to this album so that I can give him it back and tell him how rubbish it is." And so I stuck it on, was doing weights, and I didn't like it. Like my instant reaction. I feel bad saying that now, but I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. Honestly, I hated it. I really disliked it. It was too modern. The production was too kind of light. There wasn't like, everything was just. It was just all right. It was just all kind of nothing blew me away. His voice didn't blow me away. I hated how it sounded like it was recorded in somebody's bedroom, which actually I later realised that it was recorded in somebody's bedroom. It was recorded in somebody's flat. It was recorded in David Gray's flat in London. And I think that's what makes it so amazing. Actually, I only realised, I think in retrospect, of course, because the truth is, I wanted to hate it. Like, I wanted to hate the album just because I didn't want to admit to David that I liked it. And I think we do that too much as humans. We let our egos get in the way of our own enjoyment. Animals just, if you look at animals, they just live in instinct. They get up and they have their wants and needs, and that's it. Whereas as humans, we're so complicated. We have too many sort of preconceived ideas about what brackets we fit into, and then I think that sometimes hinders our chances of seeing everything the world has to offer. And certainly that I was bad for that when I was younger, especially with music, as I've mentioned in previous episodes. So this was an album that I just wanted to hate, and I stuck it on, and I thought, yeah, it's rubbish, not into it at all. Gave him it back, told him I didn't like it, and he didn't like my Queen album either, and that was that, and that was fine, and we're still pals. But anyway, I don't think I appreciated the album at all. Even ego aside, I really just didn't appreciate it until years later. I was playing in a famous Glasgow piano bar called the Baby Grand. The Baby Grand's an amazing. If you're ever in Glasgow, you need to go and visit the Baby Grand. It's a really cool sort of pub, bar, grill, frequented hugely by performers. There's a lot of the King's Theatre in Glasgow's just around the corner, and there used to always be people who were in the shows. All the actors and actresses from maybe musical theatre or plays and things, they would go there late at night after the show finished, and the shift in there would be maybe 10 o'clock at night till 1 in the morning. You would play piano and sing, and I got a job working in their newer, they'd opened a place in the West End, a piano bar as well, and I played in there on a Thursday night. And one of the things that was good about the job was that it sort of made me have to listen to other bands and artists, because people would come up and request songs, and some of them are regulars, and they would be expecting you to have learned something the next time they came in. So I remember one night somebody came up and asked me to learn Babylon and This Year's Love by David Gray, and he said, I'll be in next week or the following week, can you learn them for me and play them on the piano? And so I said, yeah, no worries. So I wrote them in my wee requests book of songs that I had to learn. And I remember going back home either that night or the next day after my shift, and I thought, right, I better listen to these songs that I have to learn. And I stuck on the White Ladder album to listen to Babylon, This Year's Love, and yeah, all of a sudden I just thought, oh God, this album's really good. It's really good. And it reminded me of like the first few months of working my first job after I left school. I'd actually stayed there for about 5 years, and I actually met my wife Lindsay there. We met there. That's a story for maybe another episode, if I can pluck up the courage for a sort of cheesy love story. But we met in Parklands when we both worked there together at that time, and I met a lot of great friends that I still speak to today. So yeah, it made me reminisce when I heard the song back. I'd actually just quit working there not long before I took on the piano bar job. So it was all quite fresh, and I'd worked there for about 5 years. So when I heard Babylon, I was just transported back to some of those great memories of sort of becoming an adult, working your first job, and because you're hanging about with adults, you're not hanging about with your school friends anymore who've all got these same experiences that you've got. You're hanging about with people who are maybe 10 years older, 20 years older, and you very quickly become more mature. And yeah, that song just reminds me of that time. It was a great time in my life, and it reminds me of making new friends and having an absolute laugh and a riot with all these folk that I just met. So yeah, that's the wee story of what it takes me back to. You can put in the comments why it's special to you. Does it remind you of something in your life? Does it remind you of starting university? Does it remind you of getting married? Does it remind you of your kids being born? Whatever. What does it remind you of? David Gray. I'll talk a bit about David Gray. He released the album. He'd actually released 3 albums before White Ladder, so quite folky singer-songwriter albums. And then he wrote and recorded White Ladder, his 4th album, in his apartment in London, as I said before. And he self-released it in Ireland first, which is, I'm not actually sure why he chose Ireland. I should have done my homework. You can Google that. He released it in Ireland first, and it sold very quickly. Sold like 100,000 copies, and he had to sort of re-release or burn more CDs. Back then you had to, it was like, if you self-releasing, you can only have so many at a time, because you don't have loads of money just to burn off millions of CDs in preparation or anticipation of them selling or going platinum. So he very quickly had to come up with more of the actual hardware product. And releasing without a record company was pretty unheard of back then. I mean, a lot of people self-release now because of, due to the advent of like music streaming sites like Spotify, Apple Music, all these different Amazon. You've got Alexa now. I think there's an Amazon Music as well, and all these things that you can stream on. And because of that, and internet marketing, social media, etc., you can self-release now quite easily. Whereas in the 90s or late 90s, when this album came out, almost everything you heard was released by a major record label. So the album ended up going double platinum, and to this day is the biggest selling album in Irish history, and one of the biggest selling albums worldwide of all time. So certainly, me hating it at the time certainly didn't do it any harm, because I think Davey was maybe onto something as to how successful this album was going to be. His voice, David Gray's got a really nice voice. It's interesting. It sits between sort of a folky singer-songwriter style to a kind of powerful busker. He's got the ability to do both of those things really well. He's got a lot of soul in his voice, but he's also got quite a powerful voice at times as well, when he sort of pushes a little bit more. He's a wee bit of a frogginess to his sound, like a kind of froggy epiglottal sound, due to sort of a high larynx position, but counters this really well on high notes by sort of really opening up his mouth into what we call in singing a horizontal embouchure, which is a fancy French word for mouth position. But this means that he's not only open, like vertically, but also open quite wide on the sounds, on the big notes that he goes for. So this gives a really great resonant coverage for sort of amplification and volume. And he's got a little tiny bit of fry in there as well, a little bit of kind of croak or creak, as we would call it, that adds character. And I've noticed that even more actually as his voice has matured. In preparation for this episode, I'd listened to some live acoustic versions. I always do that before doing the episode, so I can hear how the person's voice sounds just, you know, on its own with an instrument, and how does it sound now in comparison to how does it sound when on the studio album, you know, 20 years ago. And I have to say his voice is still sounding really good. I think he's in his mid-50s now, and his voice is still sounding great, still hitting the same notes, hasn't dropped any keys when he's playing live, which is nice to hear. As you know, you hear a lot of singers who struggle as they get a wee bit older. 55 is not super old, but vocally sometimes by 50, some, especially the rock singers of the 80s, a lot of them had really reduced ability by the time they got to that age. So there's a wee bit about David Gray, and that's my story for this week. As I said in the comments, please write down what makes the song special to you. If you like the song, tell me what it makes you think of. What does it take you back to? I think we've all got that ability to listen to a piece of music, close our eyes, and maybe remember something in our lives if it was an important one. For me, as I said, it was a time of transition, growing up, becoming an adult, meeting people that weren't the school friends that I'd sort of familiarised myself with, people from different backgrounds, very different stories to mine, and the folk that I'd known growing up. You know, it reminded me of my first nights out, going clubbing, drinking, going to casinos, laughing at hilarious stories in the kitchen with all the people that worked there, and many of them that I haven't seen or spoken to for years, as happens in life, sadly, where we kind of lose touch with people when we move on from job to job or place to place. So, but yeah, it always reminds me of those first few months of working in my first job, and meeting a whole bunch of new people and going out for nights out, and a whole new life that sort of opened up for me. And it's a great song. If you haven't heard the original, obviously give it a listen, and I hope that you'll listen to my part 2, which will come up at the end of I always do this thing, but I think it actually comes up on either side like this afterwards. So click on the part 2 to listen to my version of Babylon by David Gray, and thank you so much for listening.